Hello, Buckeye fans, and welcome to another episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. I am Patrick Murphy, and we are here today to do something we haven't done in a few weeks on this show. We're going to talk about Buckeye football. We've done deep dives into Bill Kurlick, Steve Hellwagon, Dave Biddle, kind of give you some background on some of the favorite reporters you have over at Bucknuts. Last week, we talked recruiting as we're in the midst of the recruiting camps over at the Woody Hayes Athletic Center. But today we're going to dive into the Ohio State offensive depth chart. I published a piece end of last month, kind of breaking down my projections for the depth chart. We're going to go into it. But before we get to that, this is the happy hour. We're recording this on a Friday early afternoon, so we got to have our beers, right? If you listened to me on The Fan when I was on with Tim Hall and Tyvis Pal yesterday, I said I had no beer in the house. Well, I've rectified that issue. Went to the store, got some beer. We're going to enjoy a Wolf's Ridge Hazy IPA during this show as we talk some Buckeyes. If you are joining us live here, as I crack this thing, if you have any questions, we'll probably have some time at the end to answer some Buckeye football questions. So if you have anything you want to talk about, want me to answer questions on, feel free to throw those in the comments section if you're watching this live, and I'll get to some of those at the end if we have any. If not, we'll just talk about the Buckeyes and what we think this offense is going to look like when they step onto the field for the first time at the end of August against Akron. So let's get into it. I think offensive side of the ball, there's not a ton of question marks, right? I mean, you have most of the guys that played last year coming back. There are a few, but I still think that it's worth discussing what this depth chart will look like on offense for Ryan Day and the rest of his coaching staff. So obviously, with any of these depth charts, we start at quarterback. And I guess this is a position that is still up in the air, right? You haven't had a starter named thus far. Ryan Day came out of spring, said we're still evaluating. Chip Kelly, same thing. So still up in the air, I guess. I was asked recently, if there's any chance for someone that isn't Will Howard to start at quarterback. And I think there is. This is still an open competition that will continue into fall camp. But if I am projecting a starter right now, it is Will Howard. I think you saw as the spring went on, he got more comfortable, more settled in this Ohio State offense. Remember, he's coming from Kansas State where he doesn't have the same type of weapons he talked about in the spring. They didn't have the same type of speed as some of these Ohio State wide receivers. He's also going up against an Ohio State defense that we expect to be pretty good, I think, going forward. And so I think it took Will Howard some time. I think some of the reason you saw Devin Brown, or we saw Devin Brown, I guess, kind of running the offense, being the first quarterback to go in a lot of drills was mainly because he'd been there and done that, right? This is his third offseason in the program. He knows what they're doing every day. You tell him a drill, Devin Brown's done it, right? Will Howard, maybe not so much. So it took some time to settle in. But I think you saw in the spring game, he looked a lot more comfortable. I thought he looked more comfortable towards the end of spring as well. And I think he'll carry that over into fall camp. I think he is your starting quarterback week one. Now, the question I've gotten from people I've talked to when I've done some other interviews, like, does that mean Will Howard is the quarterback the entire season? I think you could make that into a conversation, right? You do have Devin Brown, who pushed Kyle McCord into last season. Julian Sayin, the freshman transfer from Alabama, is somebody that Ryan Day said during spring practice, was in the conversation to push for that starting job. I don't think he wins it, but I do think that says a lot for a true freshman coming in, especially after going to another program. He enrolled at Alabama. He practiced at Alabama and quickly kind of got himself into that conversation. Obviously, Lincoln Kienholz, a guy who admitted early in spring that he's still kind of looking at this as almost an extension of his freshman year because he didn't enroll until the summer last year. This is the first time he's fully focused on football and not playing other sports. So he's a bit more, I don't want to say a project because that's not fair. He's played in games, but he's taken this time to develop. I think Lincoln is looking at this as more of a big picture situation and not I need to start right away type of guy. And then you have Aaron Nolan, who obviously played well at the end of the spring game, took some time also to adjust to life as a college quarterback, college student, had some injuries during spring as well. So I think it's, that's kind of how I see the pecking order right now. But for me, Will Howard is going to be your day one starter. Now, I think it would probably take either an injury or just a really rough couple of performances. If Will Howard doesn't look the part for the first few weeks, first, month or so, but the Buckeyes are getting by, and then you go out to Oregon and he just can't get the job done, maybe that's when you start to reconsider about where you are at quarterback. Do you go with Devin Brown? Do you give Julian Sayin more snaps? I think you will see some of these guys early on in the season too, and maybe early in games as well, especially a Devin Brown, as they continue to, whether or not they name a starter before the season, as they've done in the past, or wait, kind of like they did last year when it was clear Kyle McCord was the guy, but Devin Brown was still being talked about quite a bit and still pushing. So I imagine Will Howard holds this job throughout the season. I think he has the talent to do that, but there are other guys in that room that are going to keep pushing. And if he can't seize that and, really show this is my job, I am the starting quarterback for Ohio State, I can do all the things needed to be done. And that doesn't mean being CJ Stroud or Justin Fields and being a Heisman candidate. Obviously, you would love for Will Howard to raise his game to that level with the weapons he has around him. But because of those weapons he has around him, it's easy to see that Will Howard just needs to not make mistakes, get the ball to the guys that are open. We saw it with Kyle McCord, and I know a lot of people were not big fans of Kyle McCord last year. Buckeyes were undefeated, and I wrote this in something I did the other day, 37 yards from, I think it was, from scoring a touchdown, beating Michigan, and going to play in the Big Ten championship in the college football playoff game. And that's with, quote unquote, subpar quarterback play, because Kyle McCord, for, some of his flaws, all those weapons around him, that was good enough to get the job done for much of the year and almost against the team that went out and won the national championship. And then you saw kind of the drop off in the Big Ten championship game. Obviously, we don't know what Devin Brown would have done if he'd stayed healthy. So that's the way I kind of see the quarterback position playing out. I wouldn't be entirely shocked if at some point in the year the Buckeyes go to another quarterback, if Will Howard just doesn't look ready to play in some of these big games. But I also think that Will Howard has the potential to be the guy that can run this offense throughout the season. He's a smart kid. He's got an arm. Some of the deep ball stuff, I think he still needs to work on. We saw some issues with that during spring practice, but for the most part, I think he can do all of the things. Plus, he brings that mobility that the Buckeyes haven't really had. Really, all these quarterbacks can do some of that. So for me, it's Will Howard until I see otherwise. I just haven't seen anyone say or anyone do anything that's not pointing towards Will Howard or Devin Brown, but mostly Will Howard. Through one position, let's take a drink. Cheers. Reminder, if you joined us a little late, if you have any questions, Buckeye questions, college football questions, throw them in the chat if you're watching this live. We'll try and get to some of those at the end if there are any. We should have some extra time there. Let's move on now to running back. And again, not a huge mystery at this position. I think you've got TreVeyon Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. So does it matter really which running back takes the first snap of the year, who takes the first snap of each game? I don't think so. And it may be different between the two of them every game, but those are your starters. If I were, drawing out a depth chart, I'd list them together as co-starters. I think it is interesting having a new running backs coach in Carlos Loughlin, Coach Locke. Just because TreVeyon Henderson has been the starter these last 3 seasons doesn't necessarily mean he's going to. I think Coach Locke's, you can basically come in with a blank slate. I mean, he does know these guys a little bit from recruiting. Quinshon Judkins comes from his hometown. He recruited Travion Henderson out of high school, but there will be, some competition, I guess, for that first snap of the season, just from a pride thing, if nothing else. But for me, those are your clear top 2 running backs on this team. I think the reps will be split fairly evenly, assuming both guys stay healthy. I think that you can expect a good amount of production from both guys. Maybe they don't hit quite the numbers they would have if they were on their own. But I think that's better for them long term. If you end up playing 15, 16 games, whatever it may be, making a run to the national championship, those numbers will inflate naturally because you have that many more opportunities to carry the ball in those extra games, right? So, maybe the touches go up because of the number of games than they would if you're splitting between 2 backs in just 13, 14 game season. Both guys seem to be very content with working with each other. I don't think that there's animosity there at all. You talk to both of them and they've both said as much. So I think it will be an interesting thing to watch in terms of how the reps are split, how they handle having these. We've seen it in the past under Tony Alford. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Carlos Lachlan has talked about the experience he has of using multiple backs at Memphis, where he had 2 future NFL running backs in Tony Pollard and Darrell Henderson. He did it at Oregon the last 2 years, though. I think it's Bucky Irving was his lead back, but other guys got reps, got snaps. And so, as he put it, it's not his first rodeo with rotating running backs. Cheers. Beyond those 2, the depth is not great. You've got James Peoples, the freshman, Sam Williams-Dixon, another freshman, and you've got TC Caffey, who is a walk-on as it stands. I would not be surprised if TC Caffey gets a scholarship at some point in time, if the Buckeyes have extra room. He's a guy that they do believe in terms, I think we saw it a couple years ago before he got hurt. So for me, James Peoples is probably your number 2, or, I guess number 3 behind Quinshon Judkins, Travion Henderson in whatever order. And from there, you hope that you don't have to go too much deeper. If you need to rotate TC Caffey in, Sam Williams-Dixon will be interesting to watch kind of how his career plays out. He's admitted that he sees himself similar to Curtis Samuel. And if you remember Curtis Samuel, back up for Ezekiel Elliott as a running back, and then transition to more of that H-back hybrid role, eventually becoming an all-out wide receiver. And obviously that's what he's been in the NFL. So that's kind of your depth behind them. I think James Peoples is the next guy up behind your 2 starters. I've liked what I've seen from him, especially in the spring game. Both really, Sam Williams-Dixon and James Peoples, were effective in the spring game. Now, it's a spring game. I don't think you can make too much of it and, kind of the production there. But for freshmen, first time out at the Horseshoe, pulling up the numbers here, Sam Williams-Dixon had 11 carries for 78 yards and a touchdown. James Peoples, 10 for 40 and a touchdown. So it's decent numbers. And look, running back is a position that we've seen plenty of times freshmen be able to step right in and at least contribute. Now, there may be more, blocking and things like the pass protection, stuff like that guys need to work on if you want to be a starter right away. But, I mean, Travion Henderson came in, played early. I mentioned Curtis Samuel backing up Ezekiel Elliott. He got some run. Ezekiel Elliott, as a freshman, got some run. You look across the country. I mean, there's plenty of freshman running backs who come in and do well. So I think it's a position that if you needed to go to James Peoples, if you needed to use some Sam Williams-Dixon, you've got that as depth. Would you like to still have a guy like Dallin Hayden in that room that you kind of know a little bit more? Absolutely. But Dallin Hayden waited his time, didn't get the opportunity he wanted, and I don't think you can blame him for hitting the transfer portal. So you've got what you got. The Buckeyes haven't added another running back. I don't expect them to. It's hard to sell, hey, come here and be the backup behind Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson, right? A guy like Sam Williams-Dixon or James Peoples, you can do that with as they come in as true freshmen. So ideally, you rotate Travion, you rotate Quinshon as your primary guys, and then when you need to, you bring in a James Peoples, a TC Caffey, a Sam Williams-Dixon at times. The big thing will be health for sure, and I think that's going to help TreVeyon Henderson quite a bit. I wrote about a best-case scenario for TreVeyon Henderson, and honestly, I think he could have a career year even while splitting reps, just because I think he'll be better towards the end of the season. I think in the last two seasons, he has only had one or two, I forget what the number was, runs of 40 yards or longer after the first month of the season. So you can see some of that wear and tear has started to affect him. And look, TreVeyon it's a big year. He's got to prove that he's one of the best backs in the country, and he's got to prove that he can sustain and be healthy for a full season, right? I think that helps with Quinshon Judkins in the room. Cheers through the running backs. Again, if you have any questions, I saw a couple come through here in the chat. If you're watching live, throw those in there. We will get to them at the end because we should have some time here. All right, on to wide receivers. Again, not a ton of surprises here. I think your top three guys are Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, and true freshman Jeremiah Smith. Now, where I think that might get muddled a bit in terms of those three are if you're actually lining these guys up on the field, right? You could do Carnell Tate as one outside receiver, Jeremiah Smith as another outside wide receiver, and Emeka Egbuka back in the slot. But there's been a lot of talk about Emeka Egbuka moving around. And we've seen that throughout his career. The last two seasons, really, with Marvin Harrison Jr., when they had two receivers on the field, he played on the outside. When they had three, he often went to the slot. So he can do a little bit of anything. But it would not surprise me if you see more Emeka Egbuka as an outside guy in 2024, not only because he can do it, but I think from his perspective, it'll help diversify him a bit more as he heads to the NFL draft in a year's time, little under a year's time. If he shows that, I'm not just a slot guy, I can do it all. Something he did in high school. He wasn't a slot receiver coming out of high school. He was, for his high school, he was an outside guy, didn't ever really play the slot until he got to Ohio State. So if you do that, if you put a Mech outside, that probably opens the door for a Brandon Inniss or Bryson Rogers to play the slot. But who do you take out? Is it Jeremiah Smith? Do you go in the pecking order in terms of, class, age? So would you do Carnell Tate, Emeka Egbuka, Brandon Inniss, for example? I do think you add in Jaden Ballard to that mix, another outside guy with speed to burn. If he's ready to really contribute finally in his career, you may have a situation like Brian Hartline has had in the past. I think back to Paris Campbell, Terry McLaurin, Johnny Dixon, KJ Hill, Austin Mack, Benjamin Victor were a little bit in the mix there. That was 4, 5, 6-man rotation you had there. You haven't really seen that as much with the receivers these last few years. It's been pretty much the guys that started the game, played the vast majority of the snaps. And Coach Hartline's talked about, I'm not going to just take a guy off the field just to take him off the field. He's got to prove he's ready to, be a Ohio State wide receiver, do the things that are required, everything that's required of an Ohio State wide receiver. So Jeremiah Smith, I think, even if he's not completely ready to do all of the little things that they expect, he's just too talented to keep off the field. But, if Jaden Ballard has worked his way into that mix, now you're talking 5, 6 guys that are probably ready to go. Brandon Inniss and Bryson Rogers also, I think, are going to get some more playing time this year. So I think it's an interesting room to keep an eye on because maybe it doesn't have the proven star power that the Buckeyes have had more often than not in recent years. Emeka Egbuka being the obvious lone exception to that. I keep pointing to Emeka Egbuka's catch in the spring game where he had, how many catches did he have? Yeah, he had 4 catches for 47 yards, which was the most other than walk-on David Adolph. But there was the one-handed catch in particular where it was like, yeah, let me just remind you guys whose wide receiver room this is. You want to talk about Jeremiah Smith. He's been great, all that. Jeremiah Smith had 2 catches for 12 yards in the spring game. Not that that's an indictment on him or a sign of things to come, but let's not forget about Emeka Egbuka. Carnell Tate, too. He had a pretty good freshman season. So more depth in that room than I think there's been, more ready-to-play depth than maybe there's been. And so maybe you see a bit more rotation. But I think if you're lining up for the first play of the game against Akron, I would imagine you go, depending on, assuming they run out 3 wide receivers, Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, Jeremiah Smith, probably your 3 starters at that position. Next, we go to tight end. And this is one that probably, and I will say, yes, Christopher Sowers says, don't sleep on Mylan Graham. I agree with you. The only reason I didn't mention him is because he was a summer enrollee, and it often takes those guys even longer, especially at receiver, to get into the mix there. But yes, Mylan Graham, I've seen him around the facility when we've been out there for camps. Looks impressive, looks ready to go. Don't sleep on him, but probably breaks out later in the year, maybe his sophomore season. Through the receivers, cheers. Again, if you have some questions about Buckeyes, about college football, whatever it may be, you're watching this live, feel free to throw those in the chat. So tight end is interesting. Now, not the sexiest position. I think it's a position that you tend to notice more when you don't have a good one than when you do. Ohio State has been fortunate to have some good ones recently, but I think there's some questions about this position going into 2024. I have G. Scott Jr. as the starter, but I would say pencil that in as a starter more than I would say write it down in pen, at least right now. You look at G. Scott's career, and it's been sort of a mixed bag. Obviously, he starts his career at wide receiver, transitions to tight end. That's going to take some time. And I think it's only natural to, allow him to develop before we kind of make judgments. But he was in his 4th season in 2023 of college football, his 3rd season as a tight end, 10 catches for 70 yards and a touchdown. Now, you're playing behind Cade Stover, who did play a lot. I think the Rutgers game is a perfect example of G. Scott in a nutshell. He comes out. He got to start that game because Cade Stover's out. Comes out. I think he had 2 catches on the first drive, including a touchdown. It's like, oh, could this be the G. Scott Jr. game? And then he has 1 catch the rest of the game, if I remember it correctly. He ended the game with 3 for 24 and a touchdown. So I think that's kind of how it broke down. The biggest thing from my understanding with Scott is just kind of, if you just asked him to go out there and run routes, catch passes, he can do that. Maybe he isn't doing it at the level of some of the guys he came in with, maybe not to the ranking. We just haven't seen enough to kind of judge that, but he can certainly go out and run routes and catch passes. That's what he's done his whole life. It was building up his body to be the size of a tight end instead of a wide receiver. And then B, the blocking elements that he wasn't asked to do in high school. Not only because he's in high school, but because he was a wide receiver and, you're only blocking so much as opposed to a tight end at the end of the line. You're blocking an awful lot against some pretty tough guys to block. So that is where I think you need to see the biggest jump from G. Scott. Now, Ohio State did add Will Kazmarek from Ohio University, a guy who has played quite a bit throughout his career, a guy who I wrote about this earlier this offseason, believes that he was undervalued in recruiting. He came out in that 2021 class where, if you remember back to the COVID days, I don't like to think about him either, but the evaluations that coaches were allowed to do were super limited and or non-existent. And so there are guys, we've seen it, that have kind of gone under the radar, that went under the radar there and have merged maybe at some smaller programs, and hit the transfer portal, maybe end up at a bigger program. And it's like, why did this guy not jump out on the recruiting rankings or to college coaches? It's because they couldn't evaluate the way that we as an industry could in normal years. And Will Kazmarek, 42 catches, for 507 yards and 2 touchdowns at OU. Obviously, a big jump up to the Big Ten and Ohio State. He talked about that adjustment, and he made it seem like it wasn't a huge deal. I think early, probably in fall camp or in spring practice, it didn't seem that way. He was working with the ones, but as spring practice went on, you saw G. Scott start to do more of that. So as leaving spring practice, sitting here in the summer, I would say G. Scott Jr., the starter, Will Kazmarek, the backup. But the Buckeyes also have Bennett Christian, who was suspended last year, Jelani Thurman, who is a physical freak, another guy who, if he can get the blocking side and become that all-around tight end, I think he can be huge for this offense. It's just a matter of when, I think. Not if, but when that light bulb comes on. And if it's at some point this season, he could shoot up that depth chart as well. We just need to see it. Patrick Gerd is a name to know as well. He's a walk-on who has certainly proven he can do some things similar to what, not in the same roles that Mitch Rossi did, but just kind of that guy no one expected to have a role later in his career, all of a sudden emerging at the tight end position. I think he may be a guy who you see do some different things for them at that position throughout the season. I know in talking to Keenan Bailey, the biggest thing for him is putting in the work. And you have to bust your ass, for lack of a better term, to be a tight end in this team, whether it's blocking people, whether it's running routes, whatever it is. There's a clear path to playing time, and that's really what these guys need to show. So if I had to guess, that's kind of how I would lay it out. But that's a position that I still think we could see some changes once we get to fall camp, and just kind of based on how guys perform in camp heading into the season. And it could change throughout the season too. It would not surprise me if during the season you saw some guys start to get more, a guy like a Jelani Thurman, for instance, or maybe even a Will Kazmarek, as he really settles into being a part of a Big Ten offense. Maybe he starts to play more. G. Scott could also go out and play really well and hold on to that spot. And that wouldn't be surprising either. But I think this could be a position that kind of fluctuates depending on how guys perform. You certainly have options there. Now, on to the offensive line, which I think is an area of conversation, no doubt. I feel a little bit better about the offensive line after spring practice and seeing them a little bit more and talking to some people than I certainly did going into spring practice. By the way, cheers. Again, if you have questions, throw them in that chat there if you're watching live. So here's the way I have it laid out. And we'll kind of we'll go position by position afterwards. Left tackle, Josh Simmons. Left guard, Donovan Jackson. Center, Seth McLaughlin, the Alabama transfer. Right guard, Tegra Shabola. And right tackle, Josh Fryer. And then I listed backups. I think you can I didn't put them in various positions, but there's a number of guys: George Fitzpatrick, Austin Sareveld, Carson Hinsman, Luke Montgomery, Zen Mikowski. There are more guys too that could be in the mix, but those were the 5 I listed in no particular positional order, though there is some to that. So we'll start with left tackle, Josh Simmons, guy who comes in after spring, before summer last year, becomes a starter, had an up and down year. I think it was kind of, maybe up and down is not the right word, but like a slow rise, I think. By the end of the season, I think Josh Simmons was playing pretty well. And now he has a full off season with this team. You talk to people around the program, there's a lot of confidence in him after making that move from San Diego State and kind of feeling out what requires you to be a left tackle. There were talks about his penalties and things like that. That cut down over the course of the season at Ohio State. So there's a lot of confidence in him. Left guard, Donovan Jackson. I don't think I need to say much about him. There were some shaky moments early last year, but I think that may have been him playing in between a new starting left tackle and a new center, guys that hadn't really played those positions before, at least at that level. So as they got more comfortable, I think Donovan Jackson looked like Donovan Jackson. And frankly, I'm surprised that Donovan Jackson is back at Ohio State, though you could say that about a guy like Emeka Egbuka or Travion Henderson, a lot of guys on this roster that decided to come back. Center, Seth McLaughlin. I think that one is pretty understandable. He transfers from Alabama, where he was the starting center for the last year and a half, started on a team that went to the college football playoff, won the SEC. Yes, there were snapping issues. We've written about it. We've talked about it. I don't think that's going to be a problem with Ohio State. There were some things that they thought that he could work on. I didn't see anything that led me to believe in spring practice that was carrying over to this year. So for me, you don't bring him in as a center, which is what Ohio State did, to not start. Now, it is a little weird. You do have Carson Hinsman, who started for you last year at Ohio State, back again. Obviously, there were some things that happened in between the last game of the season against Michigan and the bowl game against Missouri, where caused Carson Hinsman not to start, whether you believe that was his play on the field, whether you believe that was him going on a podcast and saying some things maybe he shouldn't. Whatever the case may be, the Buckeyes felt like they should go get another guy who could at the very least play center and had some experience playing center. I think Seth McLaughlin's your starter. I'm going to skip right guard because I think that's the position with the most possibilities. We'll get back to that in a second. Right tackle, Josh Fryer. Look, Josh Fryer did not have a good first season as a starter, and he's admitted that. People within the program have admitted he needed to be better. I think the things that you've heard about him are how much time he's putting in to reshape his body, to look back at what he did wrong as the right tackle a year ago, and to elevate his game to another level. When you look at the options, there's not a ton of guys. Luke Montgomery could potentially play there. You don't have a ton of options at right tackle right now, at least guys with any sort of experience. So Josh Fryer, I think he starts the season as the tackle, and you hope that the steps that he's taken this offseason work out and he can be an improved version of what you saw last season. Otherwise, I think you do have to look at some things, and I don't think there's an obvious, okay, next man, step right in there, without some teething issues, so to speak, at the position. And then Tegra Shabola at right guard. We're going to take a drink before we go into that one. Cheers. I think you could make an argument for a few people in this position. Luke Montgomery, who going into spring would have been the guy that I would have pegged to start there. Frankly, I think you could have said move Josh Fryer to right guard, where he played 2 seasons ago as a backup and then had to start a game and then played a good chunk of another one due to injury. You can move Josh Fryer in there. That may even be his better position. Then who do you start at right tackle? That creates a whole nother series of conversations. But Luke Montgomery and then Carson Hinsman, a guy we all know started at center last season, but started the spring game at right guard. And when I posted my story on Bucknuts about the projected offensive depth chart, I had a lot of people asking me why Tegra at right guard. And I think if you look at kind of his rise throughout spring and the way that the coaching staff and some of his teammates talk about him, like there's a player here. And I think they've started to see more and more of it. And I think you saw in the spring game when he took some snaps, with a decent amount of snaps, I believe, with the first team offensive line, there you could see why there's some excitement about this kid who may finally be blossoming into the player that they hope he can be. Now, that's not to say that Carson Hinsman couldn't do the same thing there, or Luke Montgomery, but no one's told me this. It's just kind of a sense that I get that assuming Tegra continues to do the things that he's expected to do and continues to develop, like that's a guy that I don't want to say want to put there, but know can play and can work his way into that position by the start of the season. Would it surprise me if one of those other guys, Carson Hinsman, Luke Montgomery, steps into that role, starts the first game? No, I think you could certainly, have those conversations. And maybe it turns out that one of those other guys is the opening day starter, but I just have a sense about Tegra that he may be the guy in that role. So that is the offense. We've hit on each position. I think, we'll see how it shapes up. Obviously, there's a lot to go before fall camp. I didn't see a ton of questions in here, but I will answer those that I saw, maybe grab onto some comments that that I saw as well. Stephen Cherry, what are your thoughts concerning offensive line recruiting thus far? This is a big class for Justin Fry. Now, first, let me say this, and I posted this on the Bucknuts message board on the front row the other day. I think offensive line recruiting is maybe not the hardest, but one of the hardest. I think you could argue the hardest position to recruit because the development it takes from, you're watching a high school kid, first of all, and a big high school kid who's playing on the offensive line, can look the part without actually doing it. So you have to break down technique. You have to do all this stuff. And I think when you see guys, when you see rankings of guys, and I'm taking out the clear and obvious, 5 stars, top guys, very clearly really good. But once you kind of get past those first handful of guys or whatever it is in each class, I think there's a lot of discrepancy. And you talk to guys in our network, our guys who go out and evaluate players. You talk to coaches. I've talked to coaches at Ohio State before across the time I've been doing this. And they're like, why did they rank this kid this high? Not even necessarily about Ohio State guys, about guys that committed elsewhere. Why is this guy rated so high? You look at his film and what are they seeing here? And then you talk to guys who rate it. It's like, well, I like this guy because of this, this, and this. And, so I think there's a lot that goes into offensive line recruiting. And it's hard to evaluate a high school prospect and know what he's going to do at the next level because there's a lot of development that takes place once you get to college at that position. And not that there isn't at other positions. I just think there's more, a running back, like I said earlier, usually a good running back in high school, you can identify that guy can probably come in and play fairly early in his career. Wide receiver, same type of thing. Not that you don't have to develop these guys, but there's a path to playing time. There's more nuance to figuring out offensive linemen. So I think some of that is part of it. So if you look at some of Ohio State's recent offensive line commits, maybe they don't rank as high, but I do know, I'll take the Armstrong kids, for instance, the Armstrong twins. They were not guys that rated super high in our rankings. What I do know is Ohio State really liked what they saw, Justin Fry included. And I just ran into both of them out at camp. Boy, do they look the part. Walking by them over at the Woody. They have put on weight, and they were big kids. I interviewed them a couple years ago. They were big kids already. So we shall see kind of how it all, who has the last laugh, right? Is it Justin Fry and the Ohio State staff in terms of their evaluations of guys like the Armstrong twins and some of the other players? Or is it, guys in our network that didn't think they were as good? We'll find out. They have landed Carter Lowe already in this upcoming class. There are a number of kids. There was just a camp yesterday with several good prospects there. So, it is getting close to put up or shut up time for Justin Fry. I know he is considered a developer. We'll see what this year's offensive line looks in terms of, we just talked about it. Josh Simmons, Josh Fryer, Tegra, do these guys develop the way that they should and kind of take that next step? I think that's part of the process too. But yes, Ohio State, certainly you would love to see them each year, some 5 stars, high 4-star guys. But remember, Ohio State's evaluating these guys too. They are not just taking guys just to take guys. Even if it may look like that sometimes, there's a method behind that madness. Okay, let me take a look here. I think this is an interesting point from Brian Melberg. It's a good thing Ryan Day hired Jim Knowles since the offense has not been up to par. The defense is saving the Buckeyes. That was certainly the case last year. Cheers to the defense. We talked about it. The coaching staff talked about it. Ryan Day talked about it last year that they were more willing to allow the defense to win games and, the offense to kind of come into its own. And you saw that in games last year. Even the opener against Indiana, obviously, the final score is not as tight as the game was, but that game, the Notre Dame game, Penn State, obviously. So yeah, Jim Knowles, I know there's still some people out there that aren't fully on board with Jim Knowles. I don't know why, but I think you're exactly right there, Brian. Having him there, having this defense get back to silver bullet defense, that made the difference last year. If you don't have that, as the Buckeyes, maybe you lose 3 games. I mean, obviously the Michigan game, if that plays out the same, but they could have lost that Notre Dame game. Clearly, Penn State, that was a tight game throughout. So that defense certainly made a difference. Jason Craven said they're playing games I expect blowouts to get a lot of work for backups. I agree, especially early in the year. I mean, these non-conference games, nothing to get super excited about. Philip Buford, happy Friday, Pat. Happy Friday to you, Philip. Christopher Sauer said JJ should be on the field as much as possible. I know, I've heard it a lot. I've never been a guy who's going to immediately assume a freshman is going to be a star. Not that it can't happen. It certainly happened before. But I am more hesitant, which is funny because it's new NCAA or college football video game coming out. I'll definitely play freshman in that game. John Alvarez says, play Jelani with a bunch of exclamation points, and follows up with saying, I'm going to lose it if Thurman doesn't get catches. I think you make a good point. And Christopher Sauer said, how much time does Jelani get? He's talented. No doubt he's talented. It's about doing all the little things that you need on the field. And as Jason Craven points out, you need tight ends that can block first. Yeah, I mean, look at the weapons. We went through the wide receivers. I named 6 wide receivers that were capable of playing a lot for Ohio State and being impactful. You don't need the tight end to be a receiving weapon in this offense. Yes, it's great if you have a tight end that can make some plays. Obviously, you saw it with guys like Cade Stover, some other guys in the past. If all of a sudden a tight end's open down the seam, boom, big play because you're focused so much on Marvin Harrison and these other guys. But yeah, they have to be an extension of the offensive line as well. Omar Austin, what position is a glaring weakness in your opinion? I know we were just talking about offense today, but I will say the linebacker position is something that has me a little bit concerned. I think Cody Simon is a great leader, and I like the things I've heard about him, but there were times last year when he had to play that defenses, especially in the pass game, were able to target him some. CJ Hicks, he needs to take a big jump if he's going to be the other starting linebacker. And then you've got Sonny Styles, who I love as a player, but we're just assuming that the move to linebacker is going to click and it's going to work and everything. As I've said before on this show, it's not a video game. You don't just move a guy down and he's, just fine at that position. Sometimes it takes a year or so. I think Sonny can do it, but, then, Arvell Reese, guys like that, how ready are those? So for me, that maybe the offensive line, if things don't go the way I think they're going to go with that group, that's probably where I would be most concerned is with the linebackers right now. But we'll get to those on a future podcast when we do the defensive depth chart. Yeti Buck says, take a drink. I will. All right, let's see if we've got anything else here. Erica Cara said, don't sleep on the Armstrong twins. Both twins put on 30 pounds since they got there in January. Yeah, I agree. They look like they've, added a third of their body weight back on, just in terms of how big they are. I've been very impressed seeing them here recently out at some of these camps. And then Troy V said, with all these wide receivers, does a player like Bryson Rodgers or Jaden Ballard see the field? I think there's room for that. Like I was saying with the receivers, I just think Brian Hartline has that opportunity to rotate again where he hasn't, not necessarily he hasn't had the opportunity the last few years, but like there's been a clear level gap between the starters and the next guy. And that gap closes throughout the year. So like, let's think back to, 2021 when Ohio State plays Utah in the Rose Bowl. Well, you had Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, and Jackson Smith-Njigba, right? But then Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave sit out, so you see what Marvin Harrison can do in that game. Well, like Marvin Harrison, day one at Ohio State, obviously, work ethic and everything, he was very good. But like those other guys were just more ready to play. And that gap shrunk throughout the season, but by the time it shrunk, you were already into a rotation and you didn't really need to add in a Marvin Harrison Jr. And what are you going to take Garrett Wilson or Chris Olave off the field? No, you weren't going to do that. They were too good at everything, whereas Marvin was still kind of building. And obviously by the Rose Bowl, he was ready to go. And he had a month to be the guy after Garrett and Chris opt out. I think with this group, you have a Mecca who's clearly proven when he's healthy, he's one of the best receivers in the country. Don't forget, his numbers were not that far off from Marvin Harrison Jr. 2 years ago when he was mostly healthy for the season. But then you've got Carnell Tate, relatively unproven. Jeremiah Smith, super talented, completely unproven at the college level. Brandon Inniss, he has, I think, one catch, which was a touchdown, not proven. Jaden Ballard, little proven. You've seen a little bit. You know he's a deep threat. Can he do some other things? And then Bryson Rodgers, not really proven. So, you don't have that clear three guys experience. Those are your top three. So that's why I think Brian Hartline may have more wiggle room to go back to kind of that rotation he had in the past with some of those other guys, Terry McLaurin, all those guys I mentioned earlier. So that's kind of how I see it. I think there is definitely room for a guy like Bryson Rodgers or Jaden Ballard if they earn it. Brian Hartline is not just going to rotate guys to rotate guys. It's just not happening. So they have to show that, a guy like Jaden Ballard has to show he's not going to just run deep. People think about Devin Smith as like this deep threat. Devin Smith did a lot of things. He was a blocker. He, ran other routes. He just happened to catch a lot of deep shot passes because he was fast and could get behind the defense. Jaden Ballard needs to show he can do some of those other things. All right, we're going to wrap it up on a Friday Bucknuts Happy Hour. This is my first beer of the day. It will not be my last, I can promise you that. I hope all of you have a great weekend. We should be back next week. I think my plan is next week to do the defensive depth chart, but we'll see kind of what happens. There are two big recruiting camps. Well, one camp on Monday that will have some really good prospects at the camp, and then a 7-on-7 tournament on Tuesday. So maybe we pivot and have Bill Kurlick on again and really dive into kind of these camps as a whole. Big recruiting weekend. If you want to read about who's on campus for official visits, check out Bucknuts. Bill's got a ton of stuff about what's coming, whether he's published it yet or not by the time you listen to this. Beyond that, we'll see what happens. But yeah, my plan is we'll do the defensive depth chart. If something changes, we'll save that for later this summer. But I hope you all are having a good off season, and we will talk to you next week, Buckeye fans. Cheers.